this new school year as part of the Southwestern chapter of the Adventist Theological Society. So I'm just delighted that you can be here. We have a special guest, Bill Kilgore. Dr. Kilgore will be introducing him here in just a few minutes, as well as Dr. Azevedo will be having the opening prayer. A few people have had some questions about how to join the Adventist Theological Society. If you join the society, you're automatically, if you live here, you're going to be a part of our local chapter. And if you want to know about chapter events, we advertise in local church bulletins, but I'll have a little sign-up sheet in the back there where you can put your name and email, and we'll be happy to send you alerts for future meetings. This society, we don't have any appropriations from the university. It's a completely voluntary society, and so we have different speakers that come in. Some are local, some are from farther away, and that's made possible through offerings. And so if you would like to contribute, we're going to pass around an offering box. Tony Zbarzchuk, who is our secretary of our chapter for this current year, he's going to be passing that around, and so it's just free will offerings that help to make lectures like this one possible. So thank you in advance for your generosity in helping to support the chapter of the Southwestern chapter of the Adventist Theological Society. The other question that some people have is, how do I become a member? How do I join? And that's very easy. You can just go online to ATS JATS, J-A-T-S, so ATSJATS.org, and right on there you can click on membership and you can join. And I've got good news for you. If you're a student, there's a very special student rate, and being a member of the Adventist Theological Society allows you to have opportunities not only for lectures like these, but different publications such as their journal and other materials that are available. And every year in November, in conjunction with other professional meetings, they have some larger national meetings that you can participate in. Without any other further ado, I just want to, one other thing I wanted to mention is that our next ATS chapter meeting that we will have, our next lecture will be by Michael Sakupa on November 2nd. Dr. Sakupa, I guess I could call him Dr. Sakupa. He's got 2 PhDs, one in applied theology and a second in New Testament. He is one of the associate directors of the Ellen G. White Estate at the General Conference. He's been, he's a native of South Africa, has lived in different parts of the world. He's a specialist in missiology, the study of missions, and he's going to be talking about Adventism and missiology and Ellen White. So that's going to be a special opportunity to have Dr. Sakupa on our campus as well. So mark your calendars, November 2, that Sabbath will be our next ATS lecture coming up. All right, well, without any further ado, we'll have the opening prayer and followed by the introduction of our speaker.
Thank you. So let us pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful Sabbath. We ask your presence with us. Give us your Holy Spirit so we'll be able to understand more about the will and the plan you have for your church. In Jesus' name, amen.
It is a privilege today to introduce Dr. Paul McGraw. Usually we start with their academic accomplishments, and he has many. But my contact with him and his family go way beyond that. I used to run with his older brother and hang out with another older brother. And so I've known the McGraw family for quite a while. It's a tribute to a family that a pastor would have 2 sons that want to go into the ministry. Says something, doesn't it, about a pastor's family. Very thankful that Dr. McGraw is here. He graduated from Columbia Union College. I was at his high school graduation because we have family, and he's best friends with him. And we were just together in April when he had his 40th anniversary alumni for Shenandoah Valley Academy. And so he was there. But he graduated from a BA in Columbia Union College in both history and religion, I think. An MDiv from the seminary. an M.A. from George Mason in history, and a Ph.D. in George Washington at George Washington University in history. His dissertation, his area is American religious history, especially Adventism during its rise and in the 20th century. His dissertation is Born in Zion, the Margins of Fundamentalism and the Definition of Seventh-day Adventism. Now, I want to suggest to you that the recent books that many of you have read by Dr. George Knight and by Dr. Campbell that have talked about that time period coming into the 20th century, 1919 Bible Conference, and of course, death of Ellen White and the things that have taken place there. Paul, when you go back, would you tell Eric that he did not do George Knight any favors? If you read Knight's book, he says that the title for his book came from Eric Anderson, the president. Ellen White, The Afterlife. Have you seen that? I met more people saying, I'm not reading that book. And but Knight attributes it to Eric, and that I'm not surprised. But tell him he did not do him any favor. What a wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, you need to. One of the reasons why I think it's really important that Dr. McGraw is here is because there are some things and terms that we use, that we batter around, that I'm not sure we're familiar with. And they have a history, and we need to know that. What brings this to mind is about 20 years ago, we had a speaker on campus, Jack Sequeira. He was at Capitol Memorial Church at that time, had been in a mission field, and had come back and been placed in the church there. And I had him in talking to our students. And he told them, he said one time he didn't quite have the bulletin ready for Sabbath morning. So he told the secretary, listen, I'll finish it up. I'll bring it over early Sabbath morning. I'll copy it. I'll leave it out front. And then I need to make a couple hospital visits, and I'll be back. He said he made his visits, and he came back, and people were looking at him very strange. He said a couple of the elders took him aside and said, Pastor, this sermon you're going to preach today, what about it? He said, we're very concerned. He said, I got the title really from Ellen White and her writings. The title of his sermon was Faggots for the Lord. And he had taken that term right out of great controversy. Faggots for the Lord. And some of his elders were concerned. There's some terms we use. Fundamentalism, cult. I think we need some help today, Dr. McGraw. Thank you for being here with us.
There's something Bill doesn't know, and that is my dissertation title, Born in Zion, the Margins of Fundamentalism and the Definition of Seventh-day Adventism, was created by Eric Anderson. We were sitting in a place sort of like this, and I had to turn in, everything was done, but I didn't have a title for my dissertation. Eric, to this day, has never read it, but he titled it. Eric is pretty amazing with titles. But I'd like to just recount a little something from grad school. I became very good friends in grad school with a guy by the name of David Marley, who is one of the most unique people I have ever encountered in my life. David was not a Pentecostal, but went to a Pentecostal college. And he and I came in together into the program at George Washington in American Religious History. And David's like 6'5", and he had this grand thing. When my son was born while I was in grad school, from that day forward, David said, if I have a daughter, they're getting married. He's a good bit younger than I am, and 8 years later, his wife had a baby. And I was not at all surprised when I got a phone call from David, and he says, the wedding's on. Now, there was always a problem, and that was his wife. And almost immediately he says, and Debbie's on board too. I said, really? So how did this work out? Because you see, there was a problem.
Debbie had grown up Mormon. David always called me cult boy because my dissertation is essentially on the history of people calling the Adventist Church a cult. And so he just loved to call me cult boy. And the problem is that his wife said, no, none of our children can marry a Seventh-day Adventist because they're a cult. And David's favorite answer always was, no, they're not. They're just a dangerous sect. And that's where David and I are at. David, it was kind of a fun relationship. He's still just one of my favorite people in the world. David had only met one Adventist before he met me, and that was some friend's crazy uncle. And he always said, I'm really glad I met you. Well, I did find it interesting. He went down with me one time when I was pastoring to some pre-camp meeting get-togethers with some of the other pastors at Shenandoah Valley. And we sat through one of the, a friend was teaching, and we sat through one of the classes of his. And then as we get out, you have to understand, David literally is a stand-up comic. He's a history professor by day and does stand-up comedy on the weekends, and he's good. But he sat there and he says, this just proves it. The cults get all the cute girls. Because his wife had grown up Mormon. But David's comment, and if you will, the interaction between David and Debbie over the question of Adventism is something that historically has been a challenge for people that are on the more conservative side of Christianity, especially in America. Most of this comes going all the way back to the late 1880s when Dudley M. Canwright had left Adventism for the fourth or fifth time and for his final time. And Canwright had come into an existential crisis because he was debating, and Canwright was an amazing debater, but he was debating with a pastor who kept challenging him on how can you keep the commandments, have to keep the 10 Commandments, but you're saved by Jesus' sacrifice. And Canwright couldn't put the two together. And so what he does is he ends up putting out a series of articles over the year 1887 and 1888 in the Christian Advocate, Disciples of Christ Journal, that become Seventh-day Adventism Renounced. In 1889, these pieces come together into that book, Seventh-day Adventism Renounced, and it's got a subtitle that I should know because I talk about it all the time, but it's something, something, something about somebody who was one of them and all these kinds of things. And what happens is that in that book, Canwright takes Adventism apart piece by piece. He talks about the shut door, something that Adventism never talked about. In fact, we didn't talk about probably until the 1970s. I don't know how many of you know much about the shut door, but Adventism bought into it, which essentially said if you hadn't already accepted the Millerite message by the time of the Great Disappointment, probation had closed for you. We don't talk about it or didn't talk about it for good reason because it was embarrassing that we actually believed something like that. But what we did is we ended up essentially covering up our past of things that we weren't overly confident in. And so what happens is that Canwright puts out this book, and this is what I always ask my students. So he left Adventism in 1887. He publishes Seventh-day Adventism Renounced in 1889. Now, for all of you that are really sharp on this, what comes between 1887 and 1889? Ah, there you go. See, you guys are bright. Adventism changes greatly at that point. Canwright's Seventh-day Adventism Renounced is not totally accurate. It's not bad on pre-1888 Adventism. He talks about Adventists as being legalists, and I think you could pretty much make that argument, that there were a lot of folks, and it's the argument that a lot of Butler and Smith and these guys make at the 1888 conference, that they're fighting for the question of Galatians 3, what was done away with at the cross. And they fought hard that it was not the 10 Commandments, that, yep, you're saved by Jesus' sacrifice and what you do. But it changes, and it takes Adventism a long time to fully integrate into this. But Canwright his book is essentially disingenuous because it's not about Adventism post-1888. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Because Canwright's Seventh-day Adventism Renounced is the foundation for virtually any group that calls Adventism a cult. And it was the piece, and this is, I think it's very important, as Dr. Kilgore talked about here. It's very important to understand what fundamentalism means. Fundamentalism isn't a thing. It's becoming a thing by the time 1888 comes around. But fundamentalism comes up, as most religious groups do, as a reaction to something else. And the something else was modernism, liberal theology, and the idea that the Bible is not a reliable source, that we would rather trust history, or we will check the Bible by history. And fundamentalists are saying, no, that's not the way it works. The Bible is the source. And so as you get to the early decades of the 20th century, as Dr. Campbell has written about very adequately, the fundamentalist movement comes together and starts making the argument for the reliability of Scripture. In the end, the fundamentals are 5 things. And tell me what you can or can't agree with on this. The Trinity, the virgin birth, the literal second coming of Jesus, forensic justification. We are saved by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. How are we so far? Pretty much 4 for 4, right? Adventism is. The 5th was where we differed, and that was inerrancy of Scripture. As I was mentioning to a group of faculty the other day, most people who believe in inerrancy don't actually understand what it means. It does not mean that the Bible is without error. It means that the original scripts of the Bible were without error. Most inerrantists believe that what we have, there isn't an error in there, and that's not what the original inerrantists believed. And so what you end up with is this group of things, and as Dr. Campbell points out in his book on 1919, there was kind of like, and I can't remember if you used the phrase in the book or if just talking, that Adventism kind of had a little one-sided love affair with the fundamentalist movement. That we struggled with the concepts of modernism, and these folks believed many, many of the same things, maybe in a little different ways, but they believed many of the same things. The problem is that fundamentalism, in its battle with modernism, set itself up in a special way. This is something that goes back to British church history, is used often there, and that is something called the Via Media, the way of the center. What fundamentalism does is they're saying, we are in this debate, dialogue, whatever you want to call it, with modernism, but there is a group of folk over here that are totally unacceptable. You say we're unacceptable, these folks are unacceptable, and that's where the designation cult comes from. If you look at the list of typically the ones that were called the 4 major cults, they're all American-originated religions, which is kind of interesting for folks in America to decide that the stuff that comes from our own is what the problem is. And they are Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, and by the time you get to about 1910, on a fairly regular basis, Seventh-day Adventism is added into that group. One of the arguments I make in my dissertation is the reason this happens is that fundamentalism is trying to say we are mainstream. And if you look, the adherents of these cults are the people that are probably closest to fundamentalist groups. And so it's a means of trying to label your opponent. And as we talked about a little bit yesterday with some of the faculty, I think it's one of our problems today with the way that people use the term fundamentalist. We use it in the same way often that fundamentalists used it to label other groups by calling them cults. One of the things that bothers me more than anything is to hear people use the phrase Islamic fundamentalist. And I sit there and go, okay, we got the 5 fundamentals. Which of those 5 do Muslims agree with? There's a couple. You know, they would, certain branches would buy into the virgin birth. But why do we use those terms? Why do we put them together? Because it's easy. It's easy pickings. You're equating your opponent to a terrorist. Nowadays, you oftentimes hear, whenever you hear about the portions of the Mormon church that still adhere to polygamy and the like, they are Mormon fundamentalists. Has nothing to do with what a fundamentalist is. It has to do with us being able to target our opponent, and we get an extra shot at fundamentalists in the process. So I think we have to be very careful how you use that term fundamentalist. It isn't just something that you get to throw out because, I mean, as I was talking to the faculty yesterday, I can't think of a time that somebody calls somebody a fundamentalist in a complimentary way. But if you look at the fundamentals, Adventism fits right into 4 of the 5 pretty easily. But we are afraid because what happens is after the Scopes trial, and we'll get to the piece of this in a little bit, after the Scopes trial in 1925 on the issue of evolution in Tennessee public schools, fundamentalism kind of disappears. One of the things that people mainly don't understand is when you think of a fundamentalist, there's various terms, but there is one term that's sometimes thrown around is what's the difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist? And it comes out different ways, but one of them is that an evangelical has actually read a book. Because we give it's that way that they're just yahoos that don't know anything. Because the fact is, fundamentalism came up in the best universities in America. Princeton. Eventually, you get down to Westminster Theological Seminary after Princeton goes the way of the modernists. But it was very much a northern, intellectually based group. After the Scopes trial, it heads south, and they're so frustrated with what's happened in the better universities that they start their own schools. And that's where you get the Bible college movement. And the Bible college movement, we have something similar in Adventism in some of our independent schools. They don't want to have accreditation because they don't want somebody coming in and tell them what they can and can't teach. That's kind of where the Bible college movement comes from. And fundamentalism makes its way there for the better part of 2 decades, until you get Billy Graham that comes onto the scene. And Billy Graham is a respectable fundamentalist. He believed essentially the same things, but he called himself something different. He called himself an evangelical. And that spawns a different perspective. I think it's very important that we let people identify themselves rather than using pejorative terms to identify them so that they're easier targets. And this is one of the things that worries me when we use the term fundamentalism, is that it's rarely something that people are saying, yeah, I admire the fact that you adhere to some strict perspectives. When it comes to Adventism, there's a challenge that goes on within Adventism. Following the time that Dr. Campbell has talked about, by the time you get into the 1920s, Adventism and fundamentalism are, how do I say this? They're kind of playing in sandboxes next to each other, but not really willing to admit that the other one has a real sandbox. That they're finding whatever they can that's a problem. Now, this goes back to the fact that you can find in many places different fundamentalists saying that Adventism is the most dangerous of the cults because it's closest to the truth. It can siphon off people from conservative Protestant churches much more easily than Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or Christian Science. And so you see battles back and forth. One of the things that's interesting, as Dr. Campbell has pointed out, there were Adventists that were interested in the things that fundamentalists were doing because Adventism at its core was anti-modernist, or at least in the views of Scripture that the modernists were purporting. And that's why you see some of these things where you see fairly prominent Adventists showing up or trying to show up at fundamentalist movements, where you see the terms fundamentalist and modernist being used in some early Adventist literature, because we're closer to these folks. But the problem was, going back to my friend David Marley, and see if I can remember this correctly. Some of his students posted on the internet things he actually says in his history classes. And one of them was, some people say that Hitler did what he did because, his feelings were hurt when he was younger. And he says, I couldn't get a date in high school. I didn't invade Poland. Sometimes things just don't necessarily equate the way that we think they do. By the time you get into the 20s, Leroy Froome comes into the ministerial department, a brand new created thing by A.G. Daniels. It's one of the things that I admire greatly about people, that A.G. Daniels gets somewhat unceremoniously removed as president of the General Conference, but 4 years later says we need something for ministers and helps to create the ministerial department. He brings in Leroy Froome, and Froome, one of the things he does is starts Ministry Magazine. But Froome has another interesting piece to himself. I've read so much Froome stuff, I don't know what to do. I did think it was kind of funny. I posted something up on Facebook on Thursday night, and as I mentioned to the students the other day, I got a reply from Leroy Froome, his grandson. Hadn't heard from Leroy Froome in a couple of years, and I said, I'm talking about your great-grandfather tonight. Probably talking about your grandfather tomorrow afternoon. It was one of those coincidences that occurs. But what Froome does is Froome thinks it's important for Adventism to interact with these conservative Christian groups, partly because we have to make sure that they're not putting out bad information about us, but also because, and this is something that Adventists have believed for a long while about people on those margins of conservative Protestantism, this idea that these people are so close to what we believe, we can get them to come over to our side. The exact opposite of what fundamentalism believed, which was we need to marginalize these people. We need to make them look as unacceptable as possible. One of the things that Froome does almost immediately is he starts going to the encyclopedias. You guys look like you probably actually know what an encyclopedia is. Outside of Wikipedia, my students know nothing about encyclopedias. He would go through any of them that didn't have an entry on Adventism. Froome would say, by all means, I'll write you an entry on Adventism. Any of them that had somebody else who had written something that was very pejorative toward Adventism says, you do realize that's wrong. How about if I write you a right one? And Froome starts this process of, in some ways, battling fundamentalism, but battling them in an attempt to be able to legitimize Adventism, which seems like a reasonable thing. And we're going to get to, in a few minutes, people in Adventism aren't that fond of it. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. One of the things that I found very interesting in research that I did was Froome had a struggle with a guy by the name of B.G. Wilkinson. Wilkinson ran the theology department at Washington Missionary College, and how do I say this? Wilkinson wasn't always a nice guy, but he came out with a book in 1930 called The Authorized Version Vindicated, that essentially said the King James Version of the Bible is the only truly Christian version of the Bible. He wanted to have it published by the Review and Herald. Froome was on the book committee that said, no, we don't believe that. They reject the book, and so Wilkinson has it published on his own and puts on the title page, Benjamin G. Wilkinson, dean of the School of Theology, Washington Missionary College. Well, they didn't have a dean of the School of Theology, but that didn't really matter. And Froome spent a chunk of the next 2 years going to any journal that had reviewed Wilkinson's book and saying, we don't believe that. To Froome, the best thing Adventism could do is get its truth out there and not what was being caricatured about it. The thing I did find interesting on that is Froome writes to Willie White and asks him, he says, well, what did your mom have to say? This is 1931 or 32, I believe. What did your mom have to say about the King James Version of the Bible? Did she say it's the only version of the Bible that was, legitimate? And Willie White says she didn't use it. It was kind of surprising to find out. He says, but everybody, every time she's quoted, it's the King James Version of the Bible. He says, yeah, she used the American Revised Version. But we published a few things straight from that, and the people got upset. And so she would write out her stuff with the texts in the American Revised Version, and we would change them to the King James Version before they were published. Which I always try and explain to my students. It's kind of interesting that we all think that Ellen White ran the church. She couldn't even use the version of the Bible she wanted without people complaining, and finally they said, it's just not worth the hassles. We'll just put it in the King James Version for folks. But this is the kind of thing that's going on. Froome is constantly trying to legitimize Adventism. And he does it because he thinks Adventism is strong enough to play on the same field as these folks. And if we share with them what we truly believe, then all sorts of people are going to come to the truths that we have found. The backbone of the anti-Adventist movement, which was almost all coming from fundamentalism, was still Dudley Canwright. It is still to this day Dudley Canwright. It's one of the reasons why you find over and over and over again Adventism writing books against Dudley Canwright. In 1933, William Branson, the General Conference president, I can't remember if he was president in 33 or not, but he was General Conference president, writes a book entitled In Defense of the Faith, The Truth About Seventh-day Adventism, A Reply to Canwright. This is happening 40 years plus after Canwright's book comes out, and Adventism is still having to say, no, this is what we believe. He doesn't get to define us. This is what we believe. As you get into the 30s, L.R. Conradi, who had been a General Conference official and left Adventism, became a Seventh-day Baptist when he went back to Europe, he started questioning Adventism's stance on prophetic interpretation. This is what leads Froome to writing Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers. He is responding to someone's attack on Adventism. And he's saying, no, you've got this wrong. Because one of the things Conradi said is, there were all kinds of people that had this interpretation. Adventism isn't anything unique. And through 4 volumes, the shortest of which was 700 pages? Not always the easiest stuff to read, but he goes back to the early church and says, here is prophetic interpretation in the church. Most historians accept the first 3 volumes as, this is really good stuff that really hasn't been out there otherwise. The 4th volume is when he says, and it all comes down to Adventism. And the other guys have a slight problem with that. But he's legitimizing Adventism to people that are willing to look at it. Now, Froome did have this one little quirk, and that is he was rather passive-aggressive. He would write to journals that may have negatively reviewed his book, and he would say things like, well, the good journals have given a very high review to this. In fact, one of the things that gets him into the, I don't know if you want to call it a mess or what, of the evangelical conferences is because Donald Gray Barnhouse's journal, Eternity Magazine, had refused to review the final volume of Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers. And he writes a letter back, he sends them back the copy again, and says, well, all the good journals like Bibliotheca Sacra, all of these, they all have reviewed it and found it very, very good. He did that all over the place. After a while, you kind of start wondering if he didn't need to talk to somebody. But that was his method of doing things. By the time you get into the 40s, fundamentalism is coming up. They find a new voice of attack of Adventists. Similar to Canwright, had been an Adventist and left, was a guy by the name of Ernest Bradshaw Jones, E.B. Jones. E.B. Jones had been an Adventist missionary in India, decided that Adventism was not for him, and ends up writing a book entitled 40 Bible Reasons Why You Should Not Be a Seventh-day Adventist. Virtually all of that book is copying Canwright, but he does it in different words, and he has adopted enough of fundamentalism to where he's using fundamentalist terminology, and so it's very easily accepted by fundamentalists. Fundamentalists don't really care who is attacking Adventism. They want somebody to attack Adventism. And when you have a former adherent, I mean, what better weapon do you have? What Jones does is he clarifies the same charges that Canwright makes, but he does it for a new audience. And he finds things. Now, one of the things that Canwright struggled with is that if you go through Seventh-day Adventism Renounced, he nails everything that Adventism does. Legalism, he has criticisms of Ellen White, the sanctuary, but one thing that he doesn't talk about is the Trinity, or semi-Arianism. Because from the best I can tell, and I haven't seen anybody say otherwise, that's what he was. And he knows that his fundamentalist audience are very much Trinitarian, and so he just ignores that element. Seventh-day Adventism Renounced goes through 14 editions, and he puts appendices as you know, Kellogg, A.T. Jones, as all of these guys leave Adventism. He brings it up as another C. All of these great people are leaving, but he never talks about what happens in the end of the 1890s when Adventism moves into the Trinitarian camp. Doesn't talk about it because it doesn't fit his, and if he said what he believed, his fundamentalist audience would no longer listen to him. And so the challenges that you have, one of the things that Jones hits on is very important, especially with the Calvinist portion of the fundamentalist movement. There is a huge Calvinist bent to fundamentalism. Especially you get Calvinist, fundamentalist, premillennial dispensationalists. There's a lot of these folks together. And so one of the things that Jones starts attacking is the Adventist propensity toward the idea of a post-fall nature of Christ. This makes absolutely no sense to a Calvinist. How on earth could somebody believe that Jesus came with a sinful nature? It's not acceptable. And so that just ratchets things up even more. Jones also brings up the argument that Adventism did not believe that the atonement was complete at the cross. You also have pieces of folks saying that Adventists believe that the devil is actually the sin bearer. And these are the kinds of pieces that start being brought in as you end up with a new generation of fundamentalists, but still, the major portions even of what Jones does is based upon Canwright. Jones lists reasons why Adventism should be rejected, and he does it based upon fundamentalist perspectives. He knows his audience, much as Canwright had done. It's about this time, in the early 1950s, that Froome is feeling like he's making some inroads with conservative Christians. His Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers had reached out to many people because the history in it was fairly reliable. And so fundamentalists are at least willing to listen until he gets to that fourth volume. That's when he sends his fourth volume to Eternity Magazine, Donald Gray Barnhouse's journal, and they reject it. I don't know how much of this story you folks know, where T.E. Unruh had actually had interactions with Barnhouse, because Barnhouse had a nationwide radio show. Unruh was in eastern Pennsylvania, and he just writes him a letter, and he says, Barnhouse was preaching on Romans, and says, I just really enjoy the sermon series. To which Barnhouse says, how is that possible? You're an Adventist. People kind of wonder, why was he so adamantly opposed to Adventism, and why did he think Adventists were such legalists? Barnhouse grew up in Mountain View, California. He had grown up within eyesight of Adventists, and it tells you something about what somebody from the outside perceived Adventism to be, that these are people who do not believe in salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus. Unruh gets totally and completely frustrated, especially after Barnhouse. He sends Barnhouse a copy of Steps to Christ and a few other pieces of literature from Ellen White, and Barnhouse writes just a scathing attack on them in Eternity magazine, and Unruh just didn't want anything else to do with him. Barnhouse was really starting a huge publishing empire. And Barnhouse is a premillennial dispensationalist. He bought up a journal that goes all the way back into the late 19th century that was premillennial dispensationalist. They were Zionists. They were all sorts of things. And he's pushing these ideas. And so he brings in a young man by the name of Walter Martin, who had done a really good job at attacking cults. He had already written a book attacking Christian Science. He had already written a book attacking Jehovah's Witnesses. And so Barnhouse brings him in with the express purpose of writing a book on why Adventists are a cult. Martin says, well, I don't know, I want to actually talk to some Adventists, which I think is very admirable. He was not just going to take other people's word for things. He wanted to talk to Adventists. And so Barnhouse says, oh, this T.E. Unruh guy, I've had some interaction with him. Unruh wanted nothing to do with Barnhouse. And so he says, why don't you call these other ones? Martin all along wanted to talk to Froom. He had read Prophetic Faith, and he believed that it was a legitimate work of history. And that sets up what comes to be known as the evangelical conferences. Martin comes down to Washington, gets into he has a series of questions to ask to Froom. It ends up being Froom, Reed, and R.A. Anderson. And he's kind of a little bit confused because he thought he knew what Adventism believed. But when he finally gets there and he's going, hold on a second, these aren't the answers I was supposed to be getting. And so it extends the process. They have another meeting up at Barnhouse's home in Pennsylvania, and eventually Barnhouse and Martin come to the conclusion of Seventh-day Adventists are really weird, but they're Christians. By the time Martin's book finally comes out, it doesn't come out until 1961, the first 48 pages are Adventists are Christian. The next 200 pages are, but they're really weird. And this whole process of Barnhouse and Martin accepting Adventism, but the rest of fundamentalism is not going to come anywhere close to this. In 1956, you end up with Barnhouse writing in Eternity magazine, Martin writing in Our Hope, which was that premillennialist journal, both saying essentially that. They're kind of Christians. Lewis F. Talbot, who was heading up the theology department at the Biblical Institute of Los Angeles, comes back with a scathing attack on Barnhouse. And I thought, Barnhouse is an interesting character. He ends up being recorded, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. And you get a piece of his character, and he is an amazing, he's straight out. One time, this guy by the name of A.L. Hudson says something. He goes, well, you're lost. You're going to burn in hell. He didn't have a problem with being straightforward with people. But I thought it was interesting when somebody asked him, they said, you say that Adventism is Christian, but Lewis Talbot and other fundamentalists are saying, no, they're a cult. And Barnhouse says, well, He's written books that say that, and he doesn't want to stop selling books. To Barnhouse, it was that simple. Talbot cared about the money. I don't know. I think there's probably a little bit more to it than that. But something that has been controversial in Adventism ever since is the result of these evangelical conferences, and that's the book, Seventh-day Adventist Answer Questions on Doctrine. It was essentially Froome and Anderson's reply to, they say, one of the arguments that Martin made is, you're telling me things that nobody knows. You guys believe things, and people believe that you believe something totally different. You need to put something out, and that's where Questions on Doctrine came from. Now, the challenge within Adventism is that Froome makes some statements where he says Adventism believes this, and what they are is what Leroy Froome believed. And that ends up leading to some challenges. But when Questions on Doctrine comes out, it leads to all sorts of challenges. Fundamentalists are attacking Adventism because, no, you don't really believe this. One of the things, Barnhouse's Eternity magazine lost a third of their subscribers immediately after his article on Adventism. And I read through some of the letters to the editor for Eternity magazine. Most of them, the ones that were the most angry were former Adventists. One of my favorites was, if you call Adventism Christian, don't let Dr. Martin show up at the Vatican. He'll come back telling us Catholics are Christian. They're the original ones. But the Adventists, they do not believe this. You have been duped. There is no way that Adventists believe these things. And so you end up with this big battle on the fundamentalist side of things, of Barnhouse and Martin saying, we're not real fond of them, but they're Christian. And the other folks saying, no way, they don't believe, and they go across the list of things. The biggest issue, Ellen White. The Sabbath, somewhat. The state of the dead, somewhat. And so what you end up with is you end up with this battle going on the fundamentalist side. Then Adventism gets into it. Because when Questions on Doctrine comes out, there had been an underswell of opposition to what Froome had been doing, going all the way back into the late 30s and the 40s. And this is one of the challenges, that essentially what people were saying is they were taking the Beatitude, Matthew 5:11, where it says, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." The point was, if we're accepted, we're not really the remnant. And so you start seeing people saying, no, we should not be desiring this, which of course leads to one of the favorite things ever, and that is what Wilkinson used to like to do. As I mentioned, I talked to my father. I may not have mentioned this, but my father, when he was in the Navy in World War II, was baptized in San Francisco, met the associate pastor's daughter that day, my mother, and started courting her. Well, she was from California, he was from Maryland. When he gets out of the Navy, he goes to Washington Missionary College for his freshman year, comes to La Sierra to try and find himself a wife, does, and then for his senior year takes her back and finishes at Washington Missionary. Now, I'm not sure if these names will resonate much with you, but Washington Missionary is where B.G. Wilkinson was at. And La Sierra at the time is where Edward Heppenstall was at. You could not ask for more different theologies between Heppenstall and Wilkinson. And I asked my dad as I was going through my dissertation, I said, "Did you know Wilkinson?" He said, "Oh yeah, I took classes from him." I said, what can you tell me about Wilkinson?" And these were my dad's exact words. "He could find a Jesuit behind any tree." This was Wilkinson's thing. If you disagreed with him, you were a Jesuit plant. I wish I should have, you can look this up. Look up Leroy Froome on the internet for images. This is a picture of Froome with a mitre on, and it says "wanted." Leroy Edwin Froome, weighed in the balances and found wanting. For crimes against Adventism, lying, deceit, contempt, false propagation, introduction of false doctrines, closing the gap that separates us from the children of darkness, removing the landmarks of our faith. Accomplices: R.A. Anderson, A.G. Daniels, W.W. Prescott, W.E. Reed, T.E. Unruh, F.M. Wilcox, W.H. Branson. I'm not sure yet. I was just looking for my Adventist Heritage class. I was looking for an updated picture of Froome, and this is what I came across, and so that's what's on my PowerPoint, because it makes me laugh, and that's really the most important thing. I don't know if it's a parody. I don't know if it's somebody who actually believes it, but there are people out there that believe this, because to Wilkinson, if you disagreed with what he believed, you were trying to undermine the church. You were trying to do away with the message that Adventism has. Now, I'm not sure what you would call that, but it sure sounds an awful lot like the same fundamentalists that were attacking Adventism. That Wilkinson ends up using the same tactics of actual fundamentalists. Not somebody calling somebody a fundamentalist, but he's using the same tactics that the fundamentalists used in attacking Adventism. A.L. Hudson's an interesting character. Hudson was a printer in Baker City, Oregon, and when Questions on Doctrine comes out, M.L. Andreasen essentially comes out of retirement. One of the things they had done with Questions on Doctrine is that they passed it around to 250 Adventist pastors and scholars to see if it was all right. None of those was M.L. Andreasen. Andreasen was one of the chief theologians of Adventism in the 1930s and 1940s. Was it intentional? I don't have any proof, but it sure seems like it would be. And Andreasen reacts against Questions on Doctrine. Hudson publishes a series of 6 letters written by Andreasen called Letters to the Church, where he attacks Questions on Doctrine. And so you end up with this whole battle between these two sides. Adventism, at the same time that fundamentalism is attacking Adventism again, Adventism starts doing the same thing again. You come out with another book against Canwright. I was Canwright's secretary. A story of a woman who supposedly worked as Canwright's secretary and eventually said, there's all kinds of these rumors that you always run into, that Canwright on his deathbed confessed and said that he was wrong. I don't think there's any solid evidence that that ever happened. So Adventism publishes a book against Canwright. A favorite fundamentalist preacher in Michigan, where there were lots of Adventists, comes out with a book against Adventists attacking Dudley Canwright. And this is how the battle goes, back and forth between both of these sides. The theology was one piece, and I know I'm probably running out of time here. There's something else that we don't think about. We can, in the question time, if you want to have questions about QOD and those other things, that's fine. But one of the things that most people don't realize is the debt that fundamentalist / evangelical Christianity has to Adventism when it comes to questions of origin. What's his name? Where's my brain here? Ron Numbers. I know a lot of Adventists are a little bit bitter about Numbers' book, Prophetess of Health, that comes out in the late 70s. If you want to know something about the history of creationism, Ron Numbers' book, The Creationists, is excellent. He does a very good, objective job of saying what the creationists believed. He came out with, that comes out in 1990. In 1999, he comes out with an additional book that's called Darwinism Comes to America. It has an entire chapter on Seventh-day Adventism. Because he makes the argument, and I think he makes it well. Most folks don't realize that fundamentalists really don't come to the young earth, literal six-day creation side of creation until the early 1960s. And when they do, they steal all the stuff, a lot of the stuff from George McCready Price and other Adventists and just don't tell anybody where they got it because they couldn't admit that they stole this from Adventists. Most fundamentalists, going back to the Scopes trial, most fundamentalists held to either the gap theory or what's known as a special creation. That plants and animals were created millions of years ago and have evolved. But it was 6,000 years ago that humans were created. So you have two creations, the gap between the original creation, and that's what they believed essentially until the early 1960s. Now, you would never find them admitting that today, but I think Numbers does a really good job of pointing out that most creationists today owe creationism to Adventism. But again, fundamentalists would never admit to that because of their reaction against Adventism. So the challenges that Adventism and fundamentalism have is, as I mentioned earlier on, Adventism and fundamentalism are about that far apart. There is not a lot that separates the two. But they appeal to the same clientele. And so very often we end up attacking somebody who might possibly be taking our adherence. And both sides end up doing that. The challenges that come out of this battle, there's a huge challenge to this day within Adventism that goes back to the 1950s and the evangelical conferences. In 1978, Kenneth Wood wrote a secret paper for some president of the General Conference. They had a retreat, and he wrote a paper that said all the problems in Adventism can be traced back to the evangelical conferences and the publishing of Questions on Doctrine. So there's this challenge within Adventism where you have, if you will, and I'm scared to use this phrase, but you have a fundamentalist element to Adventism that are not comfortable with the more open/liberal element in Adventism. And as most things, we just sit there and butt our heads against each other because partially we can't use terminology. I was talking to the students the other day. One of the things that is kind of reviving itself in Adventism today is this idea of last generation theology. And we had a presentation in the Sabbath school class that I go to by one of our union officials who was attacking last generation theology and never actually dealt with last generation theology. They caricatured it. One of the things, how can you tell if somebody adheres to last generation theology if they refuse to go to any meeting where there's a Catholic? Really? That's what last generation theology is. Our problem is that we don't do it honestly. If you disagree with what somebody believes, go to their beliefs and deal with their beliefs and point out where their beliefs may be in error. Don't mock them. Don't create a caricature. And it's done both ways. But it's so much easier. I mean, it's what we have in our politics today. You don't actually talk about what somebody believes. You talk about something personal about them. And sadly, even within Adventism, we do the same thing. We attack a person rather than actually going into what they believe. As I was mentioning to the students the other night, John Stuart Mill, in his classic work on politics, on liberty, says something that I think we need to get to the point of. And he says, if you cannot accurately articulate your opponent's view, you have no right to articulate your own, because you don't know that your opponent isn't right. And I think that's where we have a lot of challenges today, is that people don't actually take the time to find out what the other folks believe. They just take pot shots. And that's what fundamentalists did to Adventism forever. And it's what Adventists are doing to Adventists today. And I think we need to get back to the idea of, I respectfully adhere to your disagreement. Let's talk about the things that we disagree. And not say, well, you're just a sinner. You're, that wonderful thing of Froome. You have done all these horrible things, and you're going to be found wanting. We need to move in a more of a dialogue. And I think we struggle right now with dialogues, because dialogues actually, I think, sadly, people are scared if you actually take time to study what your opponent believes, you might begin to believe it. And so I'd rather never believe it and possibly be left with what John Stuart Mill says, in error. He says, even if, and this is one of the things that we get in our politics today. He says, even if all of the people in America believed one thing and one person disagreed, that person has a right to speak. Because we don't know that they don't have truth. And that's where I think we need to get that dialogue going. Whether it's but Wilkinson over here and Heppenstall over here. I thought it was interesting talking to my dad, and I said, so where did you come down? You had Wilkinson and you had Heppenstall. And he says, well, I was in the Columbia Union. I was much more in favor of Heppenstall, but I didn't say so. Because at that day, it's kind of like the Columbia Union now is kind of farther over on the more liberal side of things, but in that day, the Columbia Union was, according to Ken Wood, when I interviewed him, he had gone to PUC, but he wanted to work in the Columbia Union because, in his words, it was, quote, the mother of orthodoxy. And so, I'm not sure where we want to go from here, Michael, but I think these are pieces that are really important for us to contemplate. The ATS, what is it called? The ARSR? Yeah, that. Sometimes we need to sit down and talk. We need to discuss without accusing. You need to say that your opponent may actually have something that's right. One illustration, it was just before the 2010 General Conference, and they had just announced they weren't even going to discuss women's ordination. And I was already scheduled to be on a panel at PUC entitled Why Stay Adventist, which was talking to our students and saying, here's why when you leave, you shouldn't leave Adventism. And one of my colleagues just went off about the women's ordination issue and just excoriating Doug Batchelor and all these kinds of things about how these idiots were doing this, that, and the other. And then they made me talk. And I said, I've got a problem because I personally am in favor of women's ordination. My father isn't. And my father's not a bad person. My father's an intelligent man. We disagree on an issue. It does not make one of us good and the other one bad. And until we get to that point where we allow our opponents to speak and allow them to define themselves, until we get to that point, we're no better off than the fundamentalists or whoever else it is just taking pot shots at people. All right, I'm done.
We have a few minutes for some questions. I've asked my colleague Buster Swoops, who has a microphone, will be on this side. I'll be over on this side. So if you just kindly raise your hand, and we'll come to you. By the way, the ASRS and ATS have a joint meeting to encourage that kind of dialogue every year now. It's a very hopeful sign.
It's what happens when you become a historian. You don't go to those meetings anymore.
Any questions?
Some years ago, was that Walter person? Was he?
Walter Martin?
Yes. Do you recall a television program anchored by John Ankerberg?
I don't remember that one. I know Martin had his radio show, The Bible Answer Man.
It seems to me he was on Ankerberg's
He very well
series.
could have been.
I know we were watching it in San Diego, and William Johnson was a guest.
Yeah, he would have Adventists on from time to time.
And Martin, that's his name?
Yeah, Walter Martin.
It seems like his conclusion was that Adventists were not a cult.
Correct.
But, I mean, that was a widespread television show.
But you then have these other elements who are fighting against that. You have Barnhouse and Martin on one side of fundamentalism. You have Lewis Talbot and just a vast array all the way up to Christianity Today when it starts in 1961 has an entire issue on why Adventism is a cult. And so you have people on both sides. I was just talking to some of the folks at lunch. Fuller of Fuller Theological Seminary hated HMS Richards with a passion. He wouldn't go to a National Religious Broadcasters meeting if they were going to invite Richards. That's the kind of animosity that you end up with. And it's why Martin is a very important case. And it's why Martin, when the Des Ford controversy hits, he comes back and says, because Martin had kind of left Adventism alone for about 15 years. And when Ford is removed, defrocked, and the like, he wants to come back and say, hold on a second here, have you turned the other way? I would argue that Adventism starts to turn back farther to the right by the end of the 1960s. And that's why you end up with, I talked to Kenneth Wood and I asked him, why did they stop publishing Questions on Doctrine? And his answer was nobody wanted to read it. But it was selling just fine. But it was deemed as being, when Wood comes in, when Pearson comes in, Adventism starts moving back a little bit the other direction. And that's what Martin was worried about by the time the Des Ford controversy happens. And he comes back and he has some fairly celebrated meetings with the religion department at Loma Linda. The thing I found quite interesting is Walter Martin, the more I read of Walter Martin, he was way more balanced than a lot of Adventists. He gets interviewed by a guy who says, first of all, this guy claims to be 3 Adventist pastors, and he was one person who wasn't an Adventist pastor. And he's interviewing Martin, and he says, well, you wrote in your book against the Jehovah's Witnesses that Charles Taz Russell wasn't even a Christian because he perjured himself in court. Ellen White plagiarized things. Why don't you say Ellen White wasn't Christian? And Martin says, well, first of all, Ellen White had the gift of prophecy. Did she make a mistake from time to time? Yes. But it does not invalidate the gift that she had from God. And then the same guy, he says, well, some people think, and this is done in 1983, so it's in the midst of all of this stuff with Walter Ray and all those things. And he says, some people think that maybe she was having epileptic fits. And I just love Martin's answer. Martin says, it's hard enough to actually diagnose somebody when you're in the room with them. Why don't we stop trying to do that with dead people? And this is an Adventist that he is defending Ellen White to, because we got so wrapped up in that. Martin, I think, did a pretty good job of trying to keep that avenue open, but you have to say, honestly, there's nothing wrong with him coming back and saying, hold on a second here. Something's happened that doesn't seem like what we talked about back in the 50s. And he comes back to the point of, by the time he dies, that, yeah, we're still there, but there's some things I'm uncomfortable with. But I at least appreciate his honesty. I don't have to agree with him, but you can say he's still honest without me agreeing with him.
This is kind of a trivial question, given the theme of the talk that you've given, and that is Ellen White's use of other versions. It seems to me that I wish I could remember where it was, but I've seen a notation in some of her writings, I think it was in the Conflict of the Ages series, where she specifically put in the footnote or right behind the text that it was the revised version that she was quoting. And I've heard different people comment on that it's significant, there's something significant in that verse, that she wanted that particular version to be
Yeah,
to be written
I
that
don't
way.
know the specific thing that you're talking about, but I can definitely see that as a possibility.
Yeah.
I try and explain to my students, Ellen White was a very balanced person. I do remember when I went to my ordination committee, I was just telling Rusty Laughlin here the other day, they asked me how I thought my administrative abilities were, and I told them I married the only organization I have. But they also asked me, do you believe that Ellen White was inspired? And I said, yes. I said, that's it? I said, yeah. I said, I have a problem with the way some people use her. But her work itself, I don't have a problem with. And people on both sides of the extremes want to make her something that she wasn't. And I think if we would just and let her speak for herself, that we would find and not come to it with preconceived ideas of, well, this has to mean this and this has to mean that. Let her speak for herself, and I think we'd be a lot happier, rather than us deciding what she can and can't mean.
If you look carefully at Great Controversy, something like a dozen different Bible versions are used in the various versions. And yes, they did go ahead and check a number of versions to make sure the verse quoted in the version they used was expressing exactly the thought that she wanted put in there.
Okay?
If you really want to know all of her use of translations, I went and counted them all up, and there's a lovely chapter in the book by Nick Saddlemeyer on the King James, Adventists and the King James. That's in the ABC. So,
cool.
What people do for fun sometimes. More questions. There we go.
I really appreciate your repeating the idea of intellectual honesty and integrity, no matter what the platform is, because otherwise discourse just dissolves. And another thing I think that we tend to forget foundationally is understanding. You may be using the same words, but understand the definition that person places on that terminology. Otherwise, you can sign the Joint Declaration of Justification, which is an extreme example, but I see that even in the own study groups that I deal with, and somebody will say that, and that has a meaning to them that's totally
I think
unfounded.
A good example is, when you get to her writings in the 90s, and people will take a phrase when she uses the word perfect, but the use of the word perfect in the 90s, and where Ellen White comes from, out of the Methodist tradition, they're having the holiness element, where the Nazarenes, and the perfect does not mean sinless. Perfect was the sense that I'm doing the best that I can. But we do what, I was talking a little bit in the sermon I gave this morning, we use presentism. We take the current meaning of a word and we superimpose it upon people in the past, rather than actually figuring out, what is she talking about? What is the influence that is coming, that is very popular at the time? What are the meanings of those words? But instead, we just say, well, she says perfect, thus it means sinlessness. And almost never does it mean that, because she's using a terminology from a different time, and we need to allow people to live when they lived. Yeah, I mean, that's why I try and get through to my history students and just, general history. Please allow people to live when they lived. I know it feels really good to be able to judge people because, oh, look at these horrible things that they did. And as I point out, just wait. If the world lasts, there's an awful lot of stuff that we do that people are going to do the same thing to, and you would say, but I'm innocent of that. We have to, the contextualization is essential.
I've heard it said that after 1844, the General Conference became very conservative, and they sent Ellen White away to Australia to get rid of her. What is the story?
All right,
on
Michael,
that?
you and I probably have. I know George Knight says that they sent her to Australia. I find it very hard to believe that Ellen White went anywhere Ellen White didn't want to go. I think she was frustrated. A lot of folks don't realize this, and I didn't realize it until I started doing some study. When my grandfather passed away in 1980, he had been a pastor. My mom took his library from California and brought it back to us in Virginia because my brother and I were both studying for ministry. And one of the things I got was my grandmother's Steps to Christ. It was a first edition, and I was shocked. I didn't realize it was a first edition because it wasn't published by the Review and Herald. And I'm going, what's the deal with this? And it wasn't until later, it was published by H. Revel and Company, a secular publishing company in Chicago. And come to find out, Ellen White would not allow the Review to print it. She said, I can't trust that they'll leave it alone. Because just before she goes to Australia is when Great Controversy comes out in 1888. But all of the issues surrounding the 1888 General Conference and Galatians and all this stuff, the Review and Herald didn't publicize it. And she felt that they weren't doing what they should do, and by the time Steps to Christ comes out, is it 92, 91, 92?
91.
She lets somebody else publish it because she says she didn't trust that they would leave it alone. And it tells you, I think she was frustrated. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it was a mutual, they were both happy to have a little break.
Well, I believe she said that she never intended to come back. She was ready to go, and when she comes back, she doesn't go to Battle Creek. That's when she comes to Elms Haven. Yeah, this is close enough.
Right up in the front. Yeah.
You're doing a book on Froome, I understand.
Yeah, maybe.
Now, he's more of a contemporary than everybody else in this series that we've dealt with. What do you think, Dr. McGraw? Why do we need to know about Froome? What do you? I know you haven't written it yet, but what do you see are some benefits that's going to help?
Well, I think one of the things that was very important about Froome is that Froome started to move Adventism away from what I refer to as apologetic history. Almost from our beginnings, and it's wrong, but it's understandable. When a group is attacked, they defend. And the group doesn't put out things that quite possibly could cause them problems. That's why we never talk about the shut door. I remember going back, I don't know, a decade or two ago, I don't remember how long ago it was now that I graduated from college, but I went back to speak at alumni, and I mentioned the shut door. And one of I hadn't actually taken a class from him, but he was in the history department there. He comes up to me afterwards and he says, "This is amazing." He said, "I wanted to do my dissertation in the 60s on the shut door and was told I would not have a job in Adventism if I did." And we didn't want to put out ammunition for our opponents. And so we created a history that really wasn't honest. We created a history that made us look good. And that's it. You can, whatever you think about what the historians in Adventism did in the 1960s and 1970s, we owe them the fact that we can now do honest history. That we can actually talk about the fact that, yeah, this is a mess. I mean, how did we end up refuting the shut door? We didn't. We just stopped talking about it. You know, because, and I used this illustration the other day, I think it was with the faculty. And this is one of my pet peeves, and so you can reject it or accept it. You know, when I talk in my Adventist Heritage class about the signs of the soon coming that happened before the Millerite movement, what you have is you have an earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal from 1755. Then you have an eclipse that occurs in a very small area of New England. Then you have a meteorite shower that happens in a very small area of New England. We still hold to those three things as proof that Jesus can come tomorrow. This is just me, but I don't know. Maybe I have a different definition of the word soon. But I would think that a quarter of a millennium isn't soon when it comes to the soon coming of Jesus. For some reason, these things made it possible for Jesus to come back in 1844. I don't know if you guys know this, but he didn't. Maybe we should stop saying that these things that happen to a little teeny area, and we'd have a little, all it is we're trying to say he could come at any moment. Fine. But let's at least be honest. But what happens is Ellen White held to these things, and we don't dare say that they weren't true because she said it, because then we're going to invalidate Ellen White. And we spend so much time, this is one of my favorite Ellen White quotes ever. It comes from the Daily controversy around 1900. And this whole battle over what the word daily meant in Daniel 8:12. And Ellen White had written early on, back in 1848, that the pioneers of Adventism had this right. But by 1900, there are other people that are saying, you know what, maybe that isn't exactly the way it should be. But you have the people who are defending her saying, no, Ellen White said this. And I just love her response to S.N. Haskell when he keeps going, we have to hold to the old view of the daily because you said this. And Ellen White's statement, I love. She says, I don't know what I meant when I wrote that. To me, something that helped me greatly is when Alden Thompson's book, Out of the Flames, comes out. And I just love the illustration he gives in the introduction. He says he was going to be teaching for the first time an Adventist history class. And so he spent the summer before that reading through the testimonies. And he said by the time he got to volume 9, he was reading a very different person that had written in volume 1. For some reason, we don't allow Ellen White to be human. We don't allow Ellen White to have matured. I kind of got in trouble one time at a pastor's meeting. I used to pastor in Potomac with my dad and my brother, and somebody was talking about something, and my dad was sitting on the other side of the room with the ministerial secretary, and I said, is it possible that we're cursed by having everything that Ellen White ever wrote? And Marvin Ray, who was the ministerial secretary, was sitting next to my dad, and he says, Paul, your dad wishes you'd shut up about right now. But think about it. We've got like grocery lists. Maybe we should say this is the essential Ellen White. Do we have everything that the Apostle Paul ever wrote? Almost certainly not. What do we have? We have probably the best, because they would say, hey, you guys got to read this. But instead, we have everything, and we try to give equal value to everything. And Ellen White herself is going, no. That wonderful illustration about Foothills Elementary School where people are saying we can't have an elementary school because Ellen White says that a mother should be a child's only teacher until they're 8 or 9 or 10 years old. But Ellen White tells them, start a school because our little kids in St. Helena are wreaking havoc on the town because they aren't going to school until 4th or 5th grade. And people say, you can't say that. You said a mother should be a child's only teacher. And she says, I'm sick and tired of people saying, Sister White says such and such, and Sister White says such and such, and I'm going to go right up to it. She said, God gave you common sense and the ability to reason, and he expects you to use both. Not only should some women not teach their children, they shouldn't have had children. That sounds like a pretty balanced person to me. But what we do is we find what we like, and we put that in a paramount position because we like it. Rather than saying, by the time you get to a mature Christian, is she saying anything differently? Is she emphasizing things any differently? But we don't like that because we like what we like. Rather than allowing her to do what I hope I do, what I'm guessing you folks hope you do, which is to mature in your relationship with God. And maybe you don't see things exactly the same when you're 75 as you did when you were 22.
Please join me in thanking Dr. McGraw for his presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
This is our first meeting for this year. We've got several events coming up. Just a little preview in October. We've got Skip McCarty, who's written a book, In Granite or Ingrained, on the covenants. I also mentioned, I think at the beginning of this presentation, Michael Sakupa will be here November 2 from the Ellen G. White Estate looking at missiology and Adventism and Ellen White. And then in December, we're fortunate to have Tom Shepard from the Andrews University, from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary. So we hope that you'll join us for those future events as this chapter continues to hold meetings. Thank you for your support and coming out this afternoon. God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
I'm anxious to read your